Welcome friends, Triumphant Base here. Today I want to talk about video game assets and cosplay. Namely two aspects, the 3D printing of models as game props and the use of 2D assets with cutting machines, or rather, why you shouldn't actually be doing either of those things. But don't fret, because they can still be valuable tools in helping you create your own. First off, I am going to preface that I'm not going to talk too much about obtaining these assets for two main reasons. The first is that extraction is a very game-by-game operation, though generally a simple search for extracting assets from game name you're looking for should get you most of the way. The second reason is that asset extraction is a mildly gray area. In most cases, provided you are extracting assets from games that you have purchased and currently own, that's the important bit, and are not redistributing the game files, this falls under fair use. However, please be mindful of any local laws regarding decryption, which can vary by country and how the assets are stored. Additionally, some games, particularly frequently updated live service games, may have restrictions on data mining in their terms of service that you should be aware of. Reminder again to not redistribute any game files. Sharing, or worse, selling game assets is illegal, even in cases where using them is not. So back to the topic at hand, I've seen a lot of props that aren't actually modeled from scratch, but are instead taken directly from the game and put straight onto the printer. I get the rationale here. They already made a perfectly good model, my printer accepts the format. Why would I bother wasting time making my own? The reason for this is that a lot of modern fairly detailed games don't actually have underlying models with a ton of polygons because that's simply not efficient. The 1.0 release of Final Fantasy XIV famously had flower pots that would slow the game to a halt because they had so many polygons that they were as detailed as a player model. Generally, game models will be roughly the right shape with a reasonable number of polygons, and they make up for the difference with texture files, 2D assets that can sometimes create fake depth, just like drawing a tunnel in a Roadrunner cartoon. My main examples today of my cosplay work in this video are both going to come from Nier Replicant, namely a 3D printed staff for Devola and Popola, and for some rubber stamps in their clothing. So here is the in-game model for the staff. As you can see, it's fairly detailed with a lot of engraving on the body and some more details around the head of the staff. But if we click to the wireframe here, you can see just how polygonal it all is. If you printed it as is, it would look just as blocky. I even took the time to do just that. This is the staff printed as is. As you can see, even on this super tiny scaled down handheld version, you can still see just how it's very distinctly blocky. No amount of sanding or painting will disguise that. Of course, you can manipulate the model a bit in different ways, similar to how this view makes it a bit smoother, but it's still fundamentally polygonal. And honestly, the work you would need to do to make the asset usable is more difficult than just using your own model. That's not even mentioning that this smooth version still wouldn't look that great printed. You could mimic a bit of depth by just with clever painting like the texture does to the game model, but again, you're just making more work for yourself. So this here is my actual staff. Sorry, I'm trying to get it all into frame. I made this from scratch using the models only as a reference, not manipulating. As you can see, I've baked all those fun emboss details from the texture straight into the actual model. So there's depth, even though I've painted this with a single color. In addition, the shape isn't exactly one-to-one. I thickened it up to give it some heft. You can see some shape alterations for taste. I made like this little lip on the moon, whereas normally just straight through. This little curve wasn't here either. And I straightened it out because it's very important to have dowels. usually as few as possible. I'm just like a rod inside that connects all these pieces since they were printed probably like 6 at a time. Like there's a seam here, and just have a single rod running through all that. But the original was a little too thin and curvy, so you couldn't really draw a straight line through that. But I tweaked my design so that it would have a sturdy half-inch rod running all the way straight down. And before I go into Fusion to show how all that was done, I want to pivot to 2D assets for a minute because they're essential for getting all these details into the staff. So as I mentioned, in addition to the staff, I also made stamps that could paint all the detail on the clothing. These were laser cut based off vectors I made. Just showing a few more of these. I've got about a dozen, but you kind of get the idea here. Just laser cut rubber. These from scratch because the actual textures look like this. As you can see, the texture here is really hard to parse with the human eye. You have to zoom in a lot to see where the details I want are. It's a little ambiguous. And since they blend into the background, it's hard to select them. Even if I could select them, when you zoom in this far, you realize that it's not actually the highest resolution. It's actually pretty bad and would look terrible if I made stamps based off these. Be very blocky. I will admit that with a high enough resolution 2D asset in a small enough project, say cutting a small bit of heat transfer vinyl, you could maybe get away with just using an asset as is or with minor tweaks, but that's definitely not true with 3D assets. Like for comparison, this is the asset sheet for Bridget from Guilty Gear Strive. You can see that they're much more clearly defined and selectable, but even with these, when I worked on this project, I still opted to create my own vectors for that, rather than using those textures, because vectors by nature are designed to scale up real easily no matter how big you make them. I use Clip Studio Paint when I make vectors. Importing the asset as a background reference, you can kind of just trace around what you see on a vector layer, making a continuous series of lines that you can freely adjust the points and curves of so that you end up with something that matches the shape of your reference. For this portion of the texture file, I cranked up the contrast a ton to mitigate that red-on-red effect, so I could work with it a little better, but there are alternative sources you could use as reference. For one, be sure to double-check any art books for your source material. For instance, this stamp that I painstakingly recreated, just looking at the texture file, yeah, that one is actually in the art book. Not all of mine were, so it was still worth doing everything I did. But there are better references out there that you should look for. Mini games also come with built-in photo modes these days, where you can take in-game screenshots from varying angles. This is great for cosplay reference because by definition, these will always look like they do in-game, because they're rendered in-game. Nier doesn't have a photo mode built in, but there is a paid mod for the PC version I was able to use to add one. As you can see, the clothing details are much more defined here, which let me knock out the rest of the stamps pretty smoothly. With those out of the way, we can pivot back to the staff and the reason for the segue. All of those details in the staff texture, I want to go ahead and make vectors for them because they can actually be used in the 3D modeling process. So now we're in Fusion, which is a CAD program, or a computer-assisted design. While programs like Blender define polygonal models, CAD programs have you define your designs as a series of geometric operations. In the end, you get an optimized model that's all nice and smooth. You can see the blocky game model I've imported on one side, and the model I made on the other, highlighting, like I mentioned, how these aren't one-to-one. I did start scaling the model to the game length I wanted, about 44 inches, but I did not use any part of it in my model. Rather, I kept it in the scene to provide visual reference. Even though I had visual tweaks I wanted to make that I mentioned earlier, I wanted to keep the proportions roughly in the same ballpark. The fun part of Fusion is that you can do a bunch of operations based on sketches in the in-engine video editor. While I use Clip Studio Paint for the more detailed vectoring because the experience is a little better for very complex shapes, this is perfectly serviceable for simpler shapes. It's nicer in many cases because you can set exact sizes, like a perfect hexagon, with a side length of 2 inches. Here, I've sketched a teardrop shape and a couple of curves that follow roughly the shape of the moon. Using Sweep, I can take that teardrop all the way around. In one operation, I've mostly got the shape down. I'll do a loft on one end of the sketch to a slightly different teardrop. Lofts try and make a transition shape between 2 selections. And on the other end, I'll do another little sweep to make a knot and then round it off here. Chamfer and fillet are both operations that let you kind of smooth out an end or a face. For the staff head, it's rotationally symmetrical, which helps a lot. I can define the whole base shape by making a little sketch like this and rotating it around the axis. You can also use the pipe tool to make tubes that follow along paths, like these ones I added around the edges. For all the little details, I'll go back into Sketch, but I only need to sketch one copy of each shape because you can use the pattern tool. Technically, since I'm selecting a circle centered on an axis, either pattern along path or circular pattern would be equivalent here. But if you had more advanced paths, you could see more advanced patterns. For the body itself, I sketched out a few guidelines for the rough shape I had in mind. As I mentioned, I wanted to use a single dowel for sturdiness, so I've made a 1/2 inch one here for reference. If I put it directly through the game model, it clips out because the game model is too thin and curvy. I've took some liberties with shape to support this and just for general taste. You aren't beholden to following designs one-to-one if you like the look of something else better. Rather than using the sketches directly because sweeps and lofts weren't behaving that well for a shape defined by that many curves, I opted to use the form tool, which lets you more or less do a 3D sketch, taking a basic 3D shape, like a cylinder, and tweaking its control points to form curves. I matched up those control points with the sketch I had made for the basic body, and I did a rounded blob form down kind of for the little bulbous end cap, and then I just did a loft for the small bit to connect them. And lastly, we can import those vectors we made for the staff body, properly scale them, and emboss, and that'll apply all of the details. And with that, you can see how much nicer my stamps and my staff look than they would if they had been just with raw assets. I hope you walk away from this presentation realizing that game assets shouldn't be used in cosplay, but they can be a valuable reference in creating their own. I've been Triumphant Base. Thanks for tuning in. Hope this helped, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.